Chapter 21. Good riddance. It had been another long week for Salazar, and Halloween was fast approaching. The feelings were getting more intense, and he was no closer to figuring out what was going on. Whatever Lucius was up to, he wasn't speaking a word about it. Dobby had come to Salazar to check in, but he didn't have any more information that he could give Salazar. All that he could say was that Lucius kept muttering that he would get what was coming to him. Dobby didn't know who he was though. He had finally been able to tell Minerva and Poppy everything. Minerva was excited about the Lockhart plan, and Poppy just laughed about it and said that Lily had always been a very clever witch. However, they both yelled at Salazar for keeping all his feelings and thoughts to himself, just like Preciousann told them to. Salazar was beginning to wonder if Preciousann was secretly writing to all of them. The only thing that bothered Salazar about the Lockhart plan was that he was afraid that Albus would be angry at Minerva and Severus. After all, that would mean that Albus himself would have to teach defense until he could find a replacement, which according to Severus was going to be very hard to do, seeing as no one wanted the job. However, Poppy mentioned, rather nastily, that it would keep Albus busy, seeing as all he did was sit up in his office trying to think up ways to place a child in danger. Everyone agreed with her, and Minerva and Severus didn't care a bit about Albus's getting mad at them. Severus decided not to write to Lucius about what had happened with Draco because he wanted to see what Draco was going to do. It turned out that Draco didn't do anything though. He just kept out of Blaze, Salazar, and Gordy's way, much to Gordy's amusement. Slytherin House was not happy with the three of them because of the brooms they were going to give to the other houses. Salazar became concerned for Gordy's safety in the dorms because of it all, so he placed the same blood protection ward around Gordy's bed that he had placed around his and Blaze's. This one though, was centered right above Gordy's bed, so it wasn't protecting anyone else. Thankfully, when they had placed the ward nothing turned up cursed. Speaking of brooms though, today was the day that they were set to arrive. Everyone in the school knew that Slytherin had received the new brooms, but no one knew what was about to happen. Severus promised that he wouldn't tell the other heads of house because he was sulking and angry over Slytherin not having the clear advantage this year, so that meant that none of the other heads had any idea what was going on either. Salazar hadn't told Fred and George, and he, Blaze, and Gordy decided it would be a nice surprise to let everyone find out together, and Slytherin House certainly wasn't going to mention it to anyone else. Salazar, Blaze, and Gordy were currently sitting at the breakfast table, and kept giving each other secretive smiles. They knew that at any moment. "Wow, look at that!" a fourth-year Hufflepuff suddenly shouted. The Great Hall was buzzing as a massive flock of owls swooped into the Great Hall carrying 21 long packages. It took 3 owls to carry each one, and everyone watched dumbfounded as all of the owls laid 7 of the packages in front of each head of house. Then one owl dropped a single letter in front of each head, who looked very mystified by the number of owls. The Great Hall was silent as everyone stared, but it was Flitwick who read his letter first. He squeaked loudly and fell out of his seat, but then he gathered himself up and stood on top of the head table, and cast a voice-amplifying charm that made his squeaky voice boom out into the Great Hall. "Dear Professor Phileas Flitwick, head of Ravenclaw House. It is with great pleasure that we at the Nimbus Racing Broom Company are able to send you our new Nimbus 2001 racing broom for each member of the Ravenclaw Quidditch team. This was made possible through a donation by the Zarbini family. We hope you all enjoy." A beaming Professor Sprout stood up. "My letter says the same, except our brooms were donated by the Potter family." As for Gryffindor, a very teary-eyed, excited Minerva stood up and said, "Ours were donated by the Ruffin family." The Great Hall was dead silent as everyone stared around at each other in shock, but then Blaze got a wicked grin on his face and stood up. "You can all thank Draco Malfoy's father for the idea," he shouted. Chaos suddenly reigned in the Great Hall as all the other houses began whooping, cheering, and hugging each other. The Ravenclaw, Hufflepuff, and Gryffindor Quidditch teams ran up to the head table to collect and unwrap their new brooms, and they all held them up high to show them off. Slytherin House stayed silent for the most part and glared at their housemates, who just shrugged, but some in the house stood up to clap politely. These, of course, were mostly families who were light or neutral. Fred and George were the first to make it to Slytherin table and nearly squashed poor Gordy with a hug. Oliver Wood was close behind them with tears in his eyes, and wouldn't stop shaking his hand, while Angelina Johnson, Katie Bell, and Alicia Spinnet wouldn't stop kissing his cheeks in thanks. Blaise was surrounded by the Ravenclaw team, and found himself hoisted on their shoulders, and Hufflepuff surrounded Salazar and shook his hand and gave him hugs. "Thank you. Thank you so much, Potter," one of the players said. "My name is Cedric Diggory. I know we have never met before, but thank you so much." Salazar smiled at the young man and nodded. "It was my pleasure. Hufflepuffs aren't the only ones who are allowed to believe in fairness." Cedric beamed at him. "No, I guess not. If there is anything I can ever do for you, please let me know. This is an amazing gift, and someday I'd like to repay you for it." Salazar shook his head. "That's not necessary. It's a gift, and I'm sure you'll use it to its fullest potential." "Oh, I will." Cedric laughed. "Well, I better go. Hufflepuff is probably going to throw a party without me." Salazar laughed as he watched Cedric bound away. Then he took a deep breath and looked around. Most of Slytherin had left the Great Hall, but there were still a few sticking around to congratulate their friends in other houses. Salazar looked at these Slytherins and nodded. There was only a few of them, but they gave him hope for the future of his house. The other houses were still in a state of celebration, and he grinned as he watched them. Up at the head table, Severus was sulking and sneering at Minerva, who was clearly teasing him. All the other professors were smiling and talking, but it was Albus who caught his eye. Albus was looking right at him with twinkling eyes and a genuine smile. He raised his glass in Salazar's direction when they looked at each other, and for the second time ever, Salazar nodded his head, raised his own glass, and gave Albus a genuine smile in return. "Gryffindor Tower is still talking about it, Harry." Neville laughed. It was Saturday and Salazar, Blaise, Hermione, and Neville were taking advantage of one of the last few semi-warm days before winter really set in, and they had been sitting outside beside the lake doing homework and just relaxing for a few hours. Gordy, along with Colin, managed to get themselves into trouble with Severus and were serving detention for back-talking. Apparently, Severus had made a scathing remark about Harry in class, and because they had potions at the same time, both Gordy and Colin yelled at him for it. Needless to say, Gryffindor had lost a lot of points that day. Neville's right. The Quidditch team has hung their brooms on the wall of the common room. Hermione said as she rolled her eyes. "I'm not a huge fan of Quidditch, and I think what you all did was very nice, but I just don't see the need in constantly talking about it." "I think it's great," Neville said with a laugh, but then his face darkened. "Ron didn't like it though." Salazar looked up from his charms paper a bit startled. "What do you mean?" "He loves Quidditch. I figured he'd be happy." "Yeah," Blaise said. "What's up with Ron? He's been awfully quiet this year. He only glares at us now, but he hasn't said much to us." "He's jealous," Hermione said, rolling her eyes again as she flipped through her Transfiguration book. "Hermione's right. He's jealous," Neville said, shaking his head. He was spouting off in the common room about the greasy, slimy Slytherins and how they probably jinxed the brooms. He's mad because he doesn't have one, and was talking about how Potter is always showing off that he has money. Fred and George told him to shut up, but he started yelling at them about being family traitors and how Potter better watch his back. "Merlin, Ron has issues. It wasn't even Harry who gave the brooms to Gryffindor in the first place," Blaise said. "He doesn't care who did it," Hermione said. "I personally think he just likes to hear himself talk. He does seem a lot angrier this year though. I'm not worried about Carrot. I will bite him again if I have to. He only needs to come near Speaker and I'll have him," Nora said with a huff as she stretched out in the grass. "Well Nora, after what Gordy did to Draco, I don't think he really wants to get too close. The whole school knows about that," Neville said. "I did thank him for sticking up for me," Hermione said quietly. "We know you did, Hermione. Gordy told us," Blaise said. She looked at him and smiled, but then she caught the look on Salazar's face. "Harry, are you okay? You're staring off into space again." He looked at her and nodded. "Yeah, I am. I think I'm going through one of those preteen hormone puberty change things," he said, waving his hands around. Hermione burst out laughing. "Well, if you are, that sure does answer a lot of questions. And explains why you have been so moody lately," Blaise teased as Salazar glared at him. Truth was, Salazar had been thinking about the Lockhart plan because after tonight, no more Lockhart, or at least they hoped. Severus had just finished brewing the completely legal General Truth Serum and would slip it in his drink tonight. Salazar was just worried that they would get in trouble with Albus. "Hey, you were right. There they are," they heard Colin suddenly shout. "Hey guys. We made it through detention in one piece," he said with a laugh as he plopped himself on the grass. "Did you manage to keep your temper in check this time?" Salazar asked, looking at Gordy with a smirk. Gordy laughed loudly. "Yes, you would have been so proud of me. Snape tried getting a rise out of me, but I didn't fall for this time," he said, looking rather smug. Salazar chuckled. "All right, as long as you held it together." "Yeah, at least you didn't act like a Gryffindor again," Blaise teased. "Hey!" All three Gryffindors protested together, and everyone broke down laughing when Colin picked up a handful of grass and threw it at Blaise. Blaise picked up his own handful of grass and tossed it back at him, which caused Neville to jump in and defend his housemate. Pretty soon lumps of grass were flying through the air as the six friends faced off. Dirt and grass was everywhere, and all six of them were covered in the stuff, but after a while, there was no more grass in the immediate area. Refusing to give up though, wands were pulled and a friendly war of tickling charms began. However, it all came to a screeching halt when everyone's least favorite professor, second to Severus, showed up wearing powder blue robes. "Ah! Such youthful innocence!" Lockhart exclaimed. "You know, I remember a time in my earlier years when I went toe-to-toe with a young wizard. He pulled his wand out like so," he said, demonstrating with an exaggerated flair. "And we dueled for hours. By the time that I got him stunned he was..." Suddenly Lockhart hit the ground in a crumpled heap, and everyone turned around quickly to find Gordy standing there with a smug grin on his face. He just shrugged his shoulders and laughed. "He was getting on my nerves," he said with a grin. Salazar just stared at him because he hadn't seen the stunning spell that had hit Lockhart. Gordy looked right at Salazar though, and gave him a small smile. Salazar took a small step backwards as he caught something in Gordy's eyes. "What was that?" Salazar thought to himself, but he didn't have time to dwell on it because Neville's laughter shook him out of his thoughts. Colin started laughing too and began to take pictures of Lockhart, and Nora even slithered on top of Lockhart's chest and posed for him. When he was done, Colin looked around at everyone and grinned. "Now what do we do with him?" he asked. "I don't know about you guys, but I have suddenly forgot the spell that wakes people up." "How about it?" Neville said with a snicker. Blaise laughed loudly. "Neville, are you acting like a Slytherin right now?" Neville grinned at him. "Maybe." "Neville, you can't just leave him here," Hermione exclaimed. "Who says we have to leave him?" Blaise said with a grin. "I'm thinking we should drag him through the dirt first because honestly, I have suddenly forgotten the levitation spell. What say you, Harry?" "That would be so wicked," Colin exclaimed. "I'll take more pictures of him looking all dirty." Salazar sighed. Can I really condone this? He thought as he looked around at the children's faces, but then he looked back at Lockhart. Yes, I can, because I really don't like him, he thought with a grin. All right. Salazar chuckled. Who is going to drag him? I'll do it. Gordy laughed, as he grabbed Lockhart's hands and began to drag him through the dirt and scattered clumps of grass. They dragged Lockhart for a good 20 feet before Hermione started yelling at them to pick him up, so Salazar levitated him and they headed for the castle. They passed several students along the way, and most of them laughed. A few of Lockhart's fangirls grew concerned, but Hermione assured them that he was fine. Although Hermione herself was fretting about getting into trouble, Salazar assured them that they wouldn't. Once they reached the castle, they passed by both Minerva and Severus, and after Salazar and the children had explained what happened, they each awarded 10 points to both Gryffindor and Slytherin. The 3 Gryffindors nearly fainted because Severus never awards Gryffindor points if he can help it. They also passed by Albus, who looked highly amused at the sight, and awarded 5 points to both houses, along with a few other professors and students, most of whom laughed. Hermione felt a lot better about the situation after that. Salazar had conveniently forgotten the most direct route to the hospital wing, and by the time they had gotten Lockhart to Poppy, they had paraded the stunned idiot around the entire castle. Twice. You look awfully happy about something. Gordy leaned over and whispered to Salazar. It was dinner time, and they were sitting at the Slytherin table. Salazar was in his normal seat at the very end, Gordy was beside him, and Blaise was sitting across from him and was engrossed in a conversation with Nora. After they had gotten Lockhart to the hospital wing, they had left quickly, and obviously Poppy had woken him up and sent him on his way. He was now sitting up at the head table looking slightly miffed about his encounter with the first and second years. Rumor had it that he spent most of the day in his rooms getting cleaned up. Right now though, Salazar was grinning like a fool because Severus had just slipped the truth serum into the man's drink, and Lockhart hadn't even noticed. However, he turned to look at Gordy and chuckled. Just one of my mood swings, I guess, he said with a smile, but then he noticed the mischievous gleam in Gordy's eyes. You're about to pull a prank, aren't you? He asked with a grin. No, what makes you think that? Salazar looking at the young lad. Gordy shook his head and laughed. I've seen that look on your face before. Salazar looked at him a bit startled. When? A few weeks ago with the defense corridor. Oh, well, I'm not playing a prank on. Why yes, Severus. I am a fraud. Lockhart suddenly declared loudly. The entire great hall stopped, and became still and quiet as everyone looked at the defense professor, who seemed completely oblivious to the fact that Minerva had cast a voice-amplifying charm on him. Severus had a wicked feral grin on his face, and Salazar couldn't help but snort, but he did notice that Severus seemed to ask another question. Yes, I do. In fact, I search out wizards who have accomplished great things and I get them to tell me all about it. Then I obliviate them. And Lockhart suddenly stopped and looked out across the hall to find that everyone was staring at him in shock. Severus must have asked another question, because Lockhart suddenly clamped his hand over his mouth to stop himself from speaking, but Severus pressed harder. And I obliviate them and take credit for their work, Lockhart shouted. Then he jumped up and immediately fell over because the chair was stuck to his bottom. Yes. Everything I have done is a lie. No, stop asking me questions. Please. Yes, I'm a fraud. Stop. Please. And I'm a liar. Please Severus stop. He pleaded, as he tried to stand again. He managed to waddle in a crouched position around the head table, but he fell down the few steps that led up to it and somehow landed in an upright, proper position in the chair, and stared out over the great hall. Students began yelling and throwing food at him, and many were shouting about how they would be telling their parents. Lockhart began waddling out of the great hall, but it was a slow-going process seeing as the chair was still stuck to his bum. Albus glared at Severus, but the potions master just sat there watching the retreating Lockhart with a smug smirk on his face. Minerva and Poppy were giggling, and the rest of the professors were outright laughing. Salazar just laughed, and he knew that Lily and James were going to love this. "You can't tell me that you didn't have anything to do with that." Gordy laughed as his dark green eyes danced with mischief. "I have no idea what you are talking about." Salazar snorted. "All right, Harry, whatever you say, my friend." Gordy chuckled, as he ate the last few bites of his dinner. Salazar just stared at him. How does he know that I had something to do with it? He thought with alarm. The thought had plagued him all night, and into Sunday. Even now, as he and the children sat in the library finishing up the week's homework, he was still pondering the mystery that is Gordy Ruffin. The lad had known about the shortcut, and Salazar was pretty sure he hadn't shown him that one. The way he talked, his mannerisms, his magic, and he had the skills of a very well-trained, talented duelist. It all seemed too familiar to Salazar. He watched the lad out of the corner of his eye though. Gordy was helping Colin with a bit of transfiguration homework, and he seemed to have knowledge about the subject that he shouldn't have. It was starting to become a bit too much for Salazar, but then he had an idea. "Hey you lot. I left my history essay in the dorm. I want to check over it again, so I'm going to go get it. I'll be back in a bit." They all nodded without looking up from what they were doing, so Salazar stood up and headed for the library's doors. It was the truth, mostly. He did want to check over his history essay, and it was in the dorms, but he had an ulterior motive as well. He needed to find Fred and George. This was something he should have done weeks ago, but he hadn't thought about until now. He needed the twins to keep an eye on Gordy at night because he wanted to see what the young lad was up to. He knew Gordy mostly stayed in the common room with him at night, but what did the young lad do after curfew and after Salazar went to bed? Salazar didn't know, but he was going to find out. He was just exiting the library when he ran right into someone, and would have fallen over if that someone hadn't caught him. He looked up in surprise, but smiled when he saw who it was. "Oh Percy, I'm so sorry." "It's all right Harry. Are you okay? You look a bit off." he asked with concern. "Yeah, I am. I'm just a bit distracted at the moment and I feel a bit overwhelmed." Percy smiled at him warmly. "Yeah, I know how it can be. Second year is a bit tougher than first year. First year is mostly taking notes and learning theories with just a bit of spell work thrown in, but second year is where you really start applying those theories and you start having to do a lot of practical spell work. It's tough at first, but it gets better by Christmas. You're pretty powerful though, and you pick up stuff pretty quickly." Salazar smiled at Percy. "Thank you, and I hope you're right," he said. "Well, I was just trying to help," he said with a smile. "It's the same thing that I've been trying to tell Ron, but he just seems so angry and moody all the time. He's been missing meals too, which is unheard of for Ron to do, and I'm worried about the pressure that he's under from his second-year studies. He yells at me, Fred, and George all the time and tells us to leave him alone and mind our own business. I'm not sure if he's studying notes or not, but all he does is sit in a corner by himself. He's been reading and writing in this little black book," Percy said, shaking his head. "He says it's a diary," a small voice said quietly. "But I don't know where he got it from." Salazar looked around and noticed that Ginny was half hiding behind her brother, and was staring at him with wide eyes. He hadn't even noticed she was there at first, but when she realized that Salazar was looking at her and that she had spoken, she squealed and ran into the library. Percy sighed and rolled his eyes. "That's Ginny, my little sister. She kind of likes me." "Yeah, I know, Fred and George already told me," Salazar said with a chuckle. Percy laughed. "Well then you must know about the image she has built up of you." "Yeah, I do. It's a little off-putting though. I hope she grows out of it." So does my family and I," Percy said with a sigh. "But, I better get in there. I promised Ginny that I would show her all the best books for first-year research." "All right, and Percy, thank you for telling me it's going to get better. I think I really needed to hear that." Percy smiled and patted Salazar's shoulder. "You're welcome, Harry." Salazar smiled as Percy entered the library. Then he turned and ran towards the dungeons to collect his essay, then began his hunt for Fred and George. As the sun sank into the horizon, darkness fell across all of the UK. Out in the cold North Sea, there stood a prison that sat on top of a hidden island. The prisoners screamed as their guards came and went, and every one of them huddled in the corners of their cells. One prisoner in particular, a man named Sirius Black, had just returned to his human form, having been a large black dog not a moment before. His wild and tangled hair hung in greasy clumps, and his eyes were mad with grief, pain, and despair. He was muttering things under his breath as he curled up into a little ball to help keep himself warm. The things he muttered over and over were heartbreaking, if one knew the truth. He was saying things like "I killed them, and it's all my fault." Suddenly, a bright ball of flame entered the man's cell, and a large beautiful phoenix landed lightly on his shoulder. The man jumped because he was so startled, but a moment later, both the phoenix and the man were gone in another flash of flames. Sirius Black appeared in a small comfortable cottage somewhere in Ireland not even a minute later, and he had to shield his eyes away from the brightness that lit up the room. He quickly noticed the roaring fire in the fireplace and jumped from the chair that the phoenix had sat him in, and stumbled his way over towards the fire's warmth. "Good evening, Sirius," a gentle voice said, and Sirius turned quickly towards the sound. "Who are you? Where am I?" he asked in a dry raspy voice, as his eyes finally adjusted to the brightness. An old wizard with long white hair and a long white beard was sitting in a simple comfortable-looking armchair. He was wearing simple green robes, and his brown eyes held a kindness in them that Sirius hadn't seen in many years. The man held a glass of cold water in his hands, and he offered it to Sirius, who had yet to move away from the fire. "Albus?" Sirius asked, as he squinted at the man and took the water glass from him. The man laughed warmly, but shook his head. "No, my good man. Not every old wizard with long white hair and a beard is Albus Dumbledore," he said with chuckle. "My name is Merlin, and Sirius, I'm here to help you."
Hey guys, what's going on? Thank you so much for watching today's episode. If you guys want to watch more like it, please subscribe to my channel and become part of the video game fanfiction plot. And please leave a comment down below and hit that like button. If you guys have any suggestions on any stories you guys want me to read, don't hesitate. They're always welcome here in the video game fanfic plot. That also goes for video games. Until next time, goodbye!